Well, welcome. This is our first session on our course on business ethics and law, and it's kind of unique. Cal Lutheran is doing two things that I don't usually see. One is we're combining a legal ethics course and an ethics course and a law course together, which is very rare. That's probably why I had trouble saying it. And second, we're tailoring it for financial planners. So rather than having a generic course in business law or a generic course in ethics, it is designed for you, the financial planner. We assume you're a CFP and you're practicing as a financial planner, and that's what our course is designed for. We are not going to spend a lot of time, quite honestly, covering anything such as security regs or insurance regulations, etc., because that's what I call specialized. We're covering the general problems that you would have operating in a practice, either as an employee or as an owner, and are concerned about what the rules are you to follow, as well as when you need an attorney. And so let's get started with our objectives for this course. At the end of this module, we expect you to be able to describe the role of ethics in Western society, understand the ethics requirements required of a CFP practitioner, explain the steps that the CFP board uses to monitor compliance to the ethics standard, and finally, discuss the basic responsibility of a fiduciary. Now, I realize a lot of organizations have ethics standards, and it's many times considered a joke. I remember a long time ago I was in an organization of professionals, and the ethics standard was don't get caught. Well, obviously, that was not today's society. Today's society has changed drastically. But again, not always do people follow the ethics. However, when you're a CFP practitioner, you must follow the ethics, as we're going to point out the penalties involved. The board takes it very serious, and I think a lot of it results from over the history of time of people doing brokerage and financial planning. We've had a lot of problem areas and ethical issues in the past, and so CFP wants to set themselves up as the organization with the best ethics. The government has tried at times. For example, the Investment Advisor Law of 1940 made investment advisors fiduciaries, which is another topic we're going to cover this week. And so I would say that this is not something new, but it's something which we are to take serious, because they do want us to be ethical. And of course, the question comes up, what is ethical? Let's look at some of the goals. First of all, we're going to cover ethics in business law that would be applicable to a certified financial planner, be you an employee or as an owner of a firm. Second, security, tax, and insurance laws are excluded for the most part from this course. The course is not designed to make you qualified to act as your own attorney or to give any legal advice. In fact, hopefully after this course you'll have a better appreciation of what legal advice is. It's designed to tell you when you need to contact a lawyer. And I like to say what you should always do is contact the lawyer before the problem, not after the problem. It's a lot easier for the lawyer, it's a lot easier for you if there is a issue on the activities. Now let's go on to what is ethics, which is our first topic in this course. And that is the title here. And it is a non-legal standard of code of behavior that is adopted. Now I footnote that because if you're dealing with the U.S. government, for example, if you're dealing with the Security Exchange Commission, you're dealing with the FBI, you're dealing with the IRS, their term ethics is legal. So when they talk about the ethics standard of dealing with the federal government or communicating with the government, such as you don't lie to the government, those ethics are really laws. However, when you're not dealing with the federal government, ethics is a non-legal standard of conduct that we adopt. We as individuals can have it, families have it. I might note that because of the fact that ethics is a Western civilization, not all cultures have the concept of ethics. I come from an East European family, and I never really thought about what ethics was until I got to college and took a course in ethics. And certainly in our family, attitude was very simple. If it's legal, you can do it. If it isn't legal, you don't do it. It was not a case of where we would have standards of our own. And that is true of most people outside of the Western civilization. Companies have standards, and I think a lot of companies today have their ethics standards posted on their walls. Certainly it's in the employee handbook. Associations, professions always have ethics standards listed. Not sure how often they practice it and require you really to do it. I do know it's required in our industry if you're a certified financial planner. And finally, societies also require it as part of meeting their obligations. Again, and this could be Kiwanis Club, Chamber of Commerce, whatever type of organization like that you belong to, again, have their standards. And I might note that ethics standard doesn't have to be higher than the law, which most of us assume it does. It could also be lower. For example, Mafia has probably the best ethics standards from the standpoint that they make everybody obey it, because if you don't obey it, you die. And there are a lot of their ethics standards are well below what we would consider legally. And there are certain industries where their ethics standards are not quite up to what we would expect to be what we call the law. And one I can think of right now is debt collection. Many times breaks the law. If you ever got a phone call at 4 o'clock in the morning about a debt, you know what I mean. I think it's best described when we talk about ethics as an agreed upon set of values, attitudes, and behaviors. And if you think of it that way, that's a good way of thinking about it. The real question is, do you have to comply or not? And again, for the CFP board, they expect you to comply with their standards, even though it's a lot higher than what the government requires. And we'll talk later in this session about fiduciary relationships. Again, very heavily involved with financial planners. And different ideas on ethics. As I mentioned, it's a Western philosophy. You're not going to find it in other cultures. For example, my wife comes from Iran, and she has 3 brothers, all who started businesses. And because of the locations where they started, and they followed their business plan, they had an ethics standard, but quite honestly, none of them really followed it because they were trained in an atmosphere or culture where ethics means nothing. So yes, they got on the board, but no one pays attention to it. And I've seen that with other people from other parts of the world. In fact, I saw it also in Hawaii a lot. For some reason, ethics has a different meaning in Hawaii, and it's probably because of the number of people there who don't come from a culture where ethics was established. There's 3 versions that I've seen that are possible sources of where ethics come from. The first is the Jewish version, which is the divine command theory of ethics. It says that ethics came from God, and what God commands is arbitrarily good and ethical, and that certainly sounds good. Then there's the one that I believe, which comes from Plato, that holds that there's an independent form outside of God that is an absolute standard of morality and ethics. And finally, we have what's the more modern. It comes from the Middle Ages, is all knowledge is relative to the individual, in which case there cannot be absolute morality. All ethics are related to circumstances, people, and cultures. That's called the modern theory, but it's been around for about 500 years. Again, this is a Western culture. It is not something that is used other places. For example, I was told that if you go east of Greece, you don't see it. And I might know ethics comes from a Greek word, and that's probably one of the reasons I think that their definition is the best. But again, that is up to individuals. Let's see, I've got posted here that most association professions have it. I'm sure you've seen it. Some companies and associations have it posted in their employee handbook or in their membership handbook. And the common standards you're going to see, and I say include but not limited to, because that's a good legal term that we're going to find, that these are types, but that's not all. There's other things that also would be included, but these three are by far, I think, the most common. Conduct yourself with the highest degree of integrity and honesty. Disclose any improper conduct, and corrective measures should be promptly instituted and carried out. Now, those are all good ideas. Again, it depends on the organization, what they do and don't do. I think the first time I ran into that is as a Boy Scout leader, and we had a whole code of ethics, and when I talked to the other Boy Scout leaders, no one knew what the ethics code was because they never looked at it. But we had one, and I'm sure not all the Boy Scouts even were knowledgeable about it. And that's true. I think a lot of associations you belong to, you don't know what the code is because you didn't see it in the material. But they all have them. I mean, that's sort of a basics of any organization today. Your problem is you got to comply with all of them. Certainly in the case of being a practitioner, you got your office policies, you've got the policies of the Financial Planning Board. If you're also working in an industry that sells stock and bonds, you've got the ethics standard for the associations you belong there. If you're in insurance associations, you got those. So all of them. And we're going to look at now that for the CFP board, because these are the ones you have to do. And if you don't, you're going to get in trouble. So we're going to spend the rest of this time period for our topic. And we're going to cover, first of all, the CFP board has issued a standard of professional ethics, and it's under the standard of professional conduct. And they have guidelines, first of all, the code of ethics called out. In addition, they have a separate set of rules of conduct, financial planning practice standards, disciplinary rules, and fitness standards for the individuals who are candidates as well as professional eligibles who want to be reinstated. In other words, people who lost their license for some reason and want to be reinstated. So all of these are going to be covered by us because, one, you got to know them for the CFP exam. Two, you're expected to comply with them. And if you don't know what they are, how do you comply with them? Let's start off with the list. And again, this is integrity, objectivity, competence, fairness, confidentiality, professionalism, and diligence. They don't mean anything by just the word. The word is this, that nothing. You have to know how it's defined. And that's one problem I've seen with a lot of associations I belong to. They have all these magic buzzwords, but they don't define them. Well, fortunately, the board does define them, and that's what we'll cover, the definition, because that's where the meat is. First of all, integrity, being honest and candor. And we want to not have any misleading or misrepresented statements. That can be very challenging to your career, quite honest. Some people do try to say things that they don't really know, and they're guessing, and we'll talk more about that later, but that actually falls under a prohibition of deceit. We also have personal integrity at all times, not just the time you're dealing with your clients. And honesty goes before personal gain, which gets the issue many times of commissions. Principle of objectivity. We should be impartial, and that's not, each client should be treated the same, but also your clients, besides your client, your management, your fellow workers, all should be treated the same. We should be intellectually moral, and prudence in making judgment for what is best for the client's need and situation. And again, the word prudence in making judgment, that is really means thinking out what you're doing before doing it. No hip shooting. That's one reason I put all my recommendations to my clients in writing. And typically after a phone call or after a meeting, I send them a message. It could be an email or it could be a letter, describing what we covered and what our solutions were, so that I make sure that I have used the best judgment I can. And in there are cases where I tell a client in a meeting, I will have to get back to you, which is not uncommon. If you're a lawyer or a CPA, you do that. You have the client come back so you get a chance to check what the latest rules are, and I think that's a good idea too. And that's part of prudence, checking it out before you give a solid answer to the client, which is, again, for me, the letter or email I send them. Principle of competence. Maintain a high degree of knowledge and skill necessary for what you provide. If you say you're an expert in retirement, you should be an expert in retirement. You should know what the IRS is requiring. You should know what the Department of Labor is requiring. You should know what is available through the various trust companies that will assist you with your retirement plans, etc., as well as knowing what all the alternatives are for the client. Continuous updating of knowledge and personal improvement are needed to maintain competence. That's why you have continuing education. Now, continuing education to me is a minimum. You have a lot more in your area of expertise that you have to do so that you know today's rules as far as, again, we'll talk about retirement planning. What changes have been made by the courts or by the legislatures that affect you, you should be up to date on. And only offer advice in your areas of competence. If you're a retirement plan expert and they ask you what type of stocks to be buying, or what type of insurance they you should have, or what kind of taxes you're going to have to pay, again, unless you have the expertise in those areas, you should either refer them to someone else or tell them that you're going to have to review it with the experts in that field, or tell them that you'll have to get back to them and then you check with the experts in those fields. But don't hip shoot in areas that you don't know about, especially outside your area of competence. Principles of fairness. You got to be fair and reasonable, not only clients, but to your principals, partners, and employers. And I think you heard this a couple of times now. It's not just the clients who we're dealing about. We're talking about us as being professionals in our life. And that includes people that we work with and your bosses, as well as, obviously, your clients. Conflicts of interest must always be provided to your client. And I would say that's probably one of the first things you do, which we'll talk about again later. Practitioners shall not be influenced or biased by prejudice or personal feelings or desires. What it's really saying is being objective rather than subjective in your decisions. No emotions in decisions. And again, I realize when you're dealing with people, there are emotions, obviously, but your thought process should be very objective. And finally, practitioners will disclose all material information relating to the engagement, collective and conflicts of interest as full transparency is required. Full transparency means full transparency to the board. Now, I realize that if you've been in other fields, full transparency doesn't mean a lot, but it certainly does in the area of being a certified financial planner practitioner. Principles of confidentiality. You're expected to hold client's data in complete confidence. And when I say complete confidence, I mean it. You don't give copies to your secretary, you don't give it to your boss, you don't give it to the other people in your office, unless you got the prior permission of your client. So you're going to say to the client, I would like to discuss this with my partner who knows more about this than I do, or I'm going to be having my secretary be typing this up, and I just want you to know that she has signed a non-disclosure agreement. These types of things, I think, are just being courteous to your client and letting them know that you do respect their privacy. Likewise, you don't go and talk to other people, such as a tax preparer, and say, I got this client, Larry Smith, and he's got this tax problem, unless you've talked to Larry Smith and first got his permission. And finally, your employer confidentially must be respected. Your employer has non-disclosure agreements on material. They have company confidentiality agreements. You must recognize those. Principle of professionalism. Courtesy, respect, and dignity to everyone. That's easy to say. It's hard to do, I know, but I think that if we think about it, it's really what I say a good ethics practice. Do unto others as you would have them do you. And if you believe in that, then it's easy to say, okay, I want to be treated nicely, and I want to have treated with dignity, etc. So, if, again, what you'd have others do unto you, that's what you want should do to others. Conduct activities in a manner that will reflect credit upon the financial planning profession. Again, sometimes we don't think about what we're doing. I know if you're in a bar, cocktail party, and sometimes you get carried away, and is it something that is going to make you or the profession look bad? You probably should think about it. I know I accidentally went into a cop's bar, and it was very quickly they found out I wasn't the cop. But I think I didn't want to be there anyhow because the way they acted in there I didn't think was very professional. And the same thing happens to financial planners. You should always, no matter what the situation is, remember your people who see you are going to think of what you do is associated with the profession. So it's always be good. Principle of diligence, and this is, I think, for many people a hard one. To me, the most important part is being on time. What you say, if you say you're going to do something on a certain time, get it done. If you can't get it done, let the client or boss or whoever know ahead of time you're not going to. Don't come in after the fact and say, oh, I'm sorry I'm late, and don't come in after the fact and not say nothing. Always let them know in advance if there's a problem doing it. Or if you have questions, always put it. And I would always put those questions in writing. If you're not sure of what you're supposed to do, and that many times requires you to do a little thought process. Check it out. And finally, the last thing to me on this is that we conduct ourselves in the manner of professionalism by always doing our due diligence prior to discussing the topic with the client. Many times, or in my case, most cases, when I'm with a client, I say, we're going to discuss this in general. You're going to give me your opinions, and we're going to discuss it. But when it comes to what my recommendations are, they're going to be in a letter that I sent to you, or maybe it's an email to you I sent to you. That's where we're going to summarize what's coming out of this meeting. So feel free to give me your thoughts, and I'll be free in trying to give you my impressions. But again, for the recommendation part, I am going to send you in writing so we both know exactly what I'm saying and what you think I'm saying. If you don't agree with what you get from me, let me know. And that works perfect. First of all, the client feels comfortable knowing exactly what's in writing is what's there to remember. And certainly if there's ever this complaint against me, I can show them the documentation. And I do this for phone calls, emails that I get from people, as well as the meetings. Let's talk a little bit about the rule of conduct that's required you as a part of our duty of being ethical as a financial planner. The board has established rules of conduct relating to clients when in a financial planning engagement, and these agreements must be in writing. And we have a fiduciary responsibility when we do this, and we're going to cover that later in this week's session, but not right now, because fiduciary is a field in itself, let's face it. Let's talk about some of the standards. Establish and define the relationship with the client, gather the data, analyze and evaluate the financial status, develop and present the recommendations, implement, and monitoring the plan. If that sounds like what you covered in your capstone class, yes, that's what you covered in your capstone class. And if you haven't taken your capstone class yet, this is what's a major part of it, and this is really what financial planning is. And I think that we're going to look at each one of them individually, but this is a good, what I call, process to use, and it's the financial planning process, what you're supposed to be using. First of all, establish the relationship. You have to identify what type of service you're provided, and you may do that with a brochure your company has. It may be using, if you're a registered investment advisor, your forms, whatever, but you identify what you provide specifically. Any conflicts of interest should be provided to the client. For example, if you're getting commissions, you get rebates, that you own stock in a company in which you're a significant shareholder, of that company, which might be a service company that you do business with. Disclose any type of compensation arrangement. And again, a lot of this is required if you're an RIA for the federal government. Determine responsibilities that you will be doing as well as what the client does. Establish the duration of the agreement, which is very important because it's a legal document, and we'll get to more of that later in the course. And provide any additional information as required to define or limit the scope of the engagement. And the last one is, well, if anything I forgot about, let's include. And that's probably a good way of putting it. I find when I deal with clients, every client is different, and every client has to be treated differently, and that everyone has a different answer for this last point. I think the first points we have here, and there's 5 of them, are pretty standard for me, but the last one is what's unique for that particular client. Gathering data, scope of the engagement should include, we define the personal and financial needs, desires, and priorities. Again, needs and desires have to be separated, and of course, priorities have to be included because we can't do everything at times. We define in writing exactly what we're going to do, and the most important point that people forget many times in financial planning, all the data that the client gives you must be returned to the client at the completion of the service you're providing. You can't retain any of it. Analyze and evaluate the financial status, and again, this is pretty standard, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but we should look at what they have and look at the alternatives, and always give the client the list of the systemic and non-systemic issues that are involved, which most of the time they're not aware of. Then we develop and present our recommendations, and it says using arts and science. Again, this material is all from the CFP board. I didn't create any of it, and using arts and science is the term they use, and I'm not quite sure what that means, but we come up with recommended data to achieve the goals, needs, and priorities. Again, with emphasis on priorities of the goals and followed by the priorities of the needs. And there must be mutually defined scope, there must be defined needs and goals and priorities. Now, you can lead them, but the decision of what the goals and priorities are has to come from the client. They cannot leave it to you. That's their responsibilities. And we use the data they provide. We use systemic and non-systemic ground rules, which we include in our documentation, the analysis and evaluation, and going over the alternatives, and we present it to the client. Sometimes present it in a PowerPoint, sometimes in a video, sometimes over the table. In fact, one person I know does it by email. What I do is typically I have a presentation where we sit down and go over all the items, and sometimes with a PowerPoint, sometimes not. But I send them a letter after our meeting in detail covering everything we've covered in the plan. Implementing the plan, well, you got a plan to put up, and one of the problems is you give it to the client, and clients don't always jump to immediately carrying it out. Sometimes they carry a part of it, sometimes they delay, and I think one of the major jobs I do is when we come up with a plan, is I help them achieve their objectives. And I help them achieve their objectives by encouraging to start the steps that we've talked about and we agreed to. And we talk about some of the things here we talk about, which is the assumptions we made, the recommendations, and if they're independent or not. Many of the recommendations are interdependent. The advantages and disadvantages of different approaches we have, the risk associated with it, which is very subjective, and how sensitive or non-sensitive the time is. Typically, I make a big point of trying to get them to start right now, and I say, we want a good financial plan, but it's based on not just for the next 30 years, but what if you die in the next week? If you get hit by a car next week, we should have a plan in place that covers what to do with your assets. So it's something that you don't wait on. Monitoring Both we, the client, and you are responsible for monitoring the plan and what the client does. And it says here, by having clear, realistic, and objective monitoring process, the clients are more apt to carry out their responsibilities. And that's a true statement. If you don't understand something, it's hard to do it. The more you understand something, the more you understand the importance of it. Some disciplinary rules. We're not spending a lot of time on it. We're covering really what I call the information you need to know. If you look at this material on the CFP board website, there's pages and pages and pages, and it's very hard to get through. So what I tried to do is summarize it, the things that are important to you. And the purpose of the discipline is to make sure we maintain the standards of CFP practitioners. I can say in my lifetime, I've heard a lot of, I think probably as many stories about bad financial planners and advisors as I have about bad lawyers and used car salesmen. Unfortunately, we're in the wrong class of people when we're dealing with them. I'd much rather have them compared us to CPAs and teachers, for example. Forms of discipline, there's 4 types: censure, letters of admonition, suspension, and revocation. And everything is done in a procedure, a process, and I'm just listing here the process. I'm not going to spend any time on it. There is an investigation before they make a decision. Now, some of you have been in associations, I'm sure, or companies where someone accuses you of something and all of a sudden they take action right away. And people don't take time to think it out. Well, the CFP board does an investigation. They will have a suspension, but they do the investigation, and they should have steps very similar to what they have in the legal area. I say similar to, but not identical, obviously. That gives you protection as a financial planner. In other words, the assumption isn't you're guilty, get the hell out of here. There's fitness standards for candidates and professionals. So let's talk about some of the unacceptable conduct. Felony conviction for theft, embezzlement, or other financially based crimes. In other words, these are financial based. Any degree of murder or rape and any other violent crime in the last 5 years. Felony convictions for tax fraud or tax-related crimes, and revocation of a financial license. Those are unacceptable. You're not going to be a financial planner with it if you're thinking of applying, and if you're a financial planner, you're going to lose your license. Now, the burden of proof is you on the following. If you have 2 or more personal or business bankruptcies. Now, people do, let's face it. I know a lot of people who've had 1, 2, 3 bankruptcies in business. That's not uncommon. So it's not going to deny you being a financial planner, but you have to explain what happened. Second, revocation or suspension of non-financial license, for example, an attorney, your real estate license, or maybe a license you had for being a notary. And the exception is if you were suspended or revoked because you didn't pay the fees. For example, a lot of times when someone has a license, the way they stop the license is just stop paying the fees. That's not going to be held against you. Felony conviction for nonviolent crimes within the last 5 years, and we look at each one on a case-by-case basis. And felony convictions for violent crimes that other than murder or rape that occurred more than 5 years ago. I apologize for the typo. It should say 5, not fee, years ago.